As is my custom, I watched Live Free with Josh Howerton. And I got to start out by saying something I don't think I've said before, and it's worth saying up front. I've learned a lot from watching this man work. I can't say that I agree with a whole lot that he says, but he's good at this. And every once in a while, I do think God speaks through him. Um, and I think that one thing I noticed here in this video, and I don't have it in front of me what it's called, but he's talking about generational curses, and what's really he's talking about is basically how he is thinking through the concept of spiritual warfare, because he's very much theologically, he's a Southern Baptist who is picking up little bits and pieces of theology that he finds out there in the ether, out there in social media, and there's a cynical version of this and there's a faithful version of this. The cynical version of it is that he's just picking up little bits of whatever will work for him and using that. And the faithful version is, Paul said, to the Jew I am a Jew, to the Greek I am a Greek, to the one under the law I am as one under the law. And, Josh is extrapolated on that a little bit and says to the young man on the internet, I am a young man on the internet. And that for sure comes through, for better or worse, that comes through. And he is genuinely talented, whether you say he's talented as a someone who's theologically literate, or if he's talented as an emotional manipulator. Emotional manipulation is a huge part of parenting. We just call it something more like formation, or teaching kids right from wrong. It's all kind of the same tool set. It's a question of application. And that's where this gets interesting, because this episode where he talks about generational curses, it's the most pastorally responsible I've ever seen him be. And I just gotta sit there for a sec, because generational curses. There's the exact verse. I forgot to bring it up here, but it talks about the sins of the father are visited upon subsequent generations. I think up to the third generation or something is what it lists in what is one of the parts of the Bible that other books of the Bible refers to the most. In the podcast, Josh claims it's the most referred to verse throughout the whole of the biblical corpus. I don't know if that's true, but it feels right, because it sure seems to come up a lot. And there's this tension, because I think the most faithful reading of what the first person to write that down meant was more of like, this is a spiritual thing. There is such a thing as a curse, and perhaps that was just them spiritualizing something that they did not have an alternate explanation for, because alcoholism runs in families. They mention lots of people come from families where there's a lot of divorce, and you can conceptualize that as a generational curse. You can conceptualize it as the parents training their children in a way that makes them. Children tend to imitate what they see, and you can tell them whatever you want, but if you do one thing, they're very likely to imitate that. And even if you tell them don't imitate that, they're very likely to imitate it anyway. And that's before you even get into the idea of genetic predispositions. Like, that's certainly something we don't know what it is, but we're pretty sure that there is such a thing as a addictive personality. And so I think what happens in this is Josh is recognizing that when you start to preach on spiritual warfare, or you borrow concepts out of spiritual warfare, you play with fire, you might get burned. And there's a lot of this stuff floating around online, powered by, basically the New Apostolic Reformation. And I mean, I think that, for a lot of people, things that come out of the Pentecostal tradition that sort of led to the New Apostolic Reformation, it's powerful. I mean, having an understanding of you know, the idea that, my anger is actually something like a spirit influencing me, and that's something that I need to contend with through prayer. That's awfully close to basically modern psychology and saying, okay, your anger is something that exists within you and that you need to develop strategies to deal with. Right? Those things are not so separate. You're clearly talking about the same thing in very different terms. And I think, well, the really interesting thing here is, like I said, he's been sending his audience spiritual warfare content, and it never really struck me how much that was what he was doing until one of the top rated comments on one of his last 2 or 3 videos is like, "Thank you, Pastor Josh, for talking about spiritual warfare." And I think he reads the comments because he seems to largely overlap with the concerns I have, because for all that I really just think that he needs to meditate on the Gospels and really center Jesus in his theology, rather than in just saying, well, Jesus is the Word, the whole book is the Word, therefore Jesus endorsed everything in it, really flattens who Jesus ought to be to believing Christians. But that's a digression. We're gonna focus mostly on what Josh gets right and where he's incomplete, with regards to spiritual warfare, because he knows the social media environment that his audiences come from. He's talking to guys. I think he says this more or less verbatim. He's talking to guys, or he might have said dudes. He loves the word dudes. He's talking to dudes who don't have much theological background, guys who are sort of finding their sense of themselves and who they are as Christians through YouTube, podcasts, social media, and like the social spiritual warfare. Cynically, probably the reason that Josh has adopted this is because spiritual warfare sells. It gives a sharper edge than the Southern Baptist theology he was brought up in. But generational curses, demonic strongholds, territorial spirits, and deliverance ministry are all things that the Southern Baptist movement, that doesn't really do them. So the content is attractive to his audience, and it's politically aligned with his broader project, but he can't ignore the harm. And he can't ignore the harm both as a man who has a basic understanding of how humans work and how these things can be dangerous to young men. And he's Southern Baptist at his core, so, which is a movement that has never been particularly, they've always looked kind of side eye askance at Pentecostals, been like, I'm not sure what those people are doing over there. It's kind of weird. I think Paul specifically said, don't be hollering and jumping up and down in church because it's distracting. But anywho, the argument Howerton actually makes ends up being a really, really resonant with the secular argument against spiritual warfare. Basically, the idea that if you say that the world is full of spirits that can attack people's minds and lead them into sin, like, ultimately what you're really telling people is be wary of your conscience because it can lead you astray. And that's something that I've heard Howerton preach on a little bit. I can't remember exactly what he came to, but there's a guy on this podcast, I don't know his last name, but his first name is Carlos, and he's clearly Latino, and he describes himself as coming from a Latin American Pentecostal background. And what Carlos describes, which is very incomplete, and I'm really like, don't read this as me criticizing Carlos, because Josh basically ambushed Carlos with all of this, and Carlos says multiple times, like, man, I'm sorry, I'm trying to take notes on what you said so I can respond. I really didn't know we were going to talk about this, so I don't have anything prepared. And Josh just gish gallops right over Carlos. For anyone who doesn't know, gish gallop is basically when you just make claim, 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 claim faster than anybody can reasonably be expected to respond to. And I think the most interesting thing that Carlos does is he talks about the Pentecostal view of sort of spiritual warfare as a, you're experiencing something difficult in your life, you need other people to pray for you. And what he's really getting at as sort of like cultural wisdom that's probably older than recorded history. The idea that it takes a village to raise a child. It doesn't take a lot of logical leaps to say it takes a village to raise a child of God, keeping in mind that we are, as Christians, we are supposed to view ourselves as all being God's children, right? And so when you talk about, I need someone else to pray for me, it sort of, it flies in the face of American conservative cultural norms. The idea that I need anybody else to do something for me. No, 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 no. I'm going to be the one to pull myself up by my bootstraps. It is by my own sins that I am condemned, not my father's. It is on me to break the cycle. But Carlos's tradition, as I understand it, and, you know, I could be getting some things wrong here, but I sort of draw my roots a little bit to a not a Pentecostal tradition, but like a very insular community where everybody knows everybody, everybody calls you friend. Bonus points if you know which song I'm quoting. But basically, if somebody knows that your grandfather was an alcoholic or that your parents are divorced and you're part of the same spiritual community, them praying for you is a little bit different than somebody in an online community saying, hey, my wife is struggling with an illness, can y'all pray for her? Because you're just so much more closely connected. If someone understands, if someone met your grandfather, they knew what he struggled with, and they see you doing similar things, they can come to you and say, hey man, I'm praying for you because I see what happened with your grandfather, and I saw how it affected him, and I don't want that to happen to you. And ultimately, because Josh has been borrowing from the spiritual warfare framework, but he's not really like from any movement that really understands that, he immediately ends up falling back on secular language. And at one point, they're talking about whether Christians can be possessed by a demon, and he's like, well, if you mean possessed in like this way that proponents of spiritual warfare typically talk about it, the Pentecostal movement talks about spirits, then no, if you've invited Christ into your life, you cannot be possessed. But, and then he brings out the dictionary and he talks about like possession not just as like having a demon inside you, but possession as like this thing that I own. And like, or a whole bunch of other definitions. And he's sort of like, well, yeah, you can be possessed by, you know, these forces in the sense that you can allow them to tell you what to do, and, you know, believe that they're sending you on the right path rather than the wrong path. And I didn't get it written down all the way. I don't think that's quite how Josh does it. But there's a moment where he talks about psychology, and he basically puts in a caveat of poo-pooing psychology as a discipline before basically describing how psychology affirms his position. And there's just all these little things that individually you're just like, that's a good point. That's a good point, Josh. That's a good point, Josh. But it's not a theological point. It's a secular point, and it's a right-wing cultural point, you know, about, you know, it's my sin that condemns me is probably, you know, it's a biblical thing. But looking at it in the long scope of, I'm a member of a society. I have responsibilities to those around me. My sin also can condemn those around me in the sense that my sin is an example that others might follow. And I need to, tend my own garden so that other people see me and are more likely to tend their own, right? Going back to that sort of idea of the pastoral responsibility that I think Josh largely gets at it, but he just doesn't. He's just not quite there. And I think that I don't know that if Carlos were ever given, I really think what Josh needs to do is take a step back and say, okay, I messed this up. I don't think I said anything wrong, but I think I need to take a step back and let Carlos explain his tradition without me stepping in and interrupting, and then respond to that rather than run over him, not giving him a chance really to defend himself. Because I think that there is a tremendous amount of value in the Pentecostal view of spirits as, agents in this world. And I think that's validated in many cases by psychology. And I think that it's virtually impossible to distinguish the two because of you know, Christians are overwhelmingly dualist. We believe that the material world and the spiritual world are both real but distinct, and they can affect each other, but they are distinct. And, saying that something is real in one's mind, depending on what exactly that is, if you're talking about gender identity, Josh Howerton is not going to affirm that. He's going to say that's of the devil, that's demonic, like he says crystals and witchcraft and stuff are. He says, I believe the direct quote is that stuff real? Yes, it's really demonic. Now, that was him speaking about crystals and the occult Ouija board type stuff, not trans stuff, but I do believe that he, in his limited spiritual warfare framework, does view those things roughly the same way. But I don't know. This was really interesting to me because it was when it became super obvious to me that Josh was buying into a lot of the spiritual warfare in a way that I hadn't really picked up on too much until I saw that YouTube comment that in all likelihood generated this podcast. But I guess the end here is let Carlos speak.